Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to the Part 1 video for Lecture 17 on Moral Relativism. In this Part 1 video, we'll basically be offering the pro side of moral relativism, or the case for moral relativism. And we'll do that by introducing Ruth Benedict, and we'll talk a little bit about who she is. And then obviously we'll talk about the idea of moral relativism. We'll try to discuss, as we like to do when we first introduce some of these moral ideas or moral theories, discuss what it is in general, position it with respect to some other competing perspectives, and then we'll talk about sort of her case for this idea of moral relativism. Why is it that she thinks morality is relative? Right? So we'll discuss what she has to say regarding this idea of value bias, how we tend to sort of uplift the values that are popular in our own culture and then minimize or demean in some sense the values that are unpopular in our own culture. And then we'll talk about, relatedly, her idea of the kind of the arbitrary nature of the evolution of values and how we have a tendency to kind of lose sight of that as the values in our own particular culture become more and more prominent, more and more dominant. We tend to think, right, that that's the proper way to look at things because everyone's looking at it that way. And she wants to point out, well, as we'll see, that's just kind of an accident. It could have been any other set of values that became popular and so on. So we'll talk about, again, this idea of value bias and, relatedly, this sort of idea that when values evolve and what becomes prominent in terms of what's valued and so on, that's in some sense kind of a matter of historical accident. And we'll discuss some of her examples of relative values, things she points out, hey, this is accepted in one culture, highly valued in one culture, and then it's disregarded and demeaned in another culture. And so she's going to suggest, well, doesn't that suggest then that morality is hence relative? And then we'll conclude this Part 1 video by discussing her conception of the idea of a deviant. I should have put this up here. So what are deviants, or who are deviants? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then in the Part 2 video, we'll offer the case against moral relativism that's offered more or less. We'll discuss what James Rachels has to say about moral relativism, and through that discussion, offer a case against moral relativism. So we'll talk about who James Rachel is. We'll talk about what he suggests is wrong with the typical line of argument offered by the moral relativists, offered by people like Ruth Benedict. He describes this typical line of argumentation as the cultural differences argument, and we'll discuss that. And then we'll discuss, why it is he thinks that's fallacious, why it's invalid or unsound. Okay? And then we'll talk about, why it is he thinks that accepting moral relativism is so problematic. So he spells out some negative consequences. If we're consistent and we truly believe in moral relativism, well, then here are some of the consequences we better be ready to accept. And then he's going to take a look, going back to that typical argument that he says moral relativist offers. It goes something like, all these different cultures view, for example, what to do with those who die differently. Therefore, and so that's the premise. These different cultures have different views regarding what to do, right? And then the conclusion, he says, that's typically offered by the moral relativist is then that there's no proper viewpoint or thing we ought to do regarding the dead, because again, all these disparate cultures have these contradicting and different views regarding what to do with the dead. And the moral relativist, he says, wants to suggest that we ought to conclude that there's no objectively proper, correct, approach to dealing with the dead. Okay, so he's going to say, go back. So we already, we're going to talk about why he thinks that's not a good argument. But then he's going to go back and actually analyze the premise of that argument. Is it in fact the case that that there are these fundamentally different values at play in different cultures? And he wants to say, well, that's typically overblown by the moral relativists. That if you reflect a little further, their cases they typically offer as suggesting that different cultures have different values. He wants to say, upon further reflection, you'll realize that actually what's at play is the same underlying value typically. And then he's going to want to argue as well that, hey, there have to be certain values in place in all existing cultures for them to exist in the first place. For example, they have to value the prohibition of murder. Otherwise, people are going to get murdered and the society won't exist. So he wants to, again, go back to that argument analyze why it is, or whether it's the case, right, that different cultures do in fact have different values. Is that really the case? And he's going to, obviously argue. He's giving the cons, right, the case against moral relativism. He's going to argue, actually upon further reflection, no, they don't have these that different of values, fundamental values. Different cultures actually have, in some sense, they have to have certain values that are in common, like prohibition against murder, and what seem like in some situations, conflicting values. Again, upon further reflection, he'll say there are other things that explain it, and really, you'll notice that they actually value the same thing. Okay, so that's, again, probably went on way too long about the part 2 video, but that's what Rachel's will then say about the case against, moral relativism. So we'll, again, look forward to hearing more about that in the part 2 video. But let's go ahead and dive into this first part video, where, again, we're going to offer the case for moral relativism, discuss a little bit about what Ruth Benedict has to say about the matter, and really, I don't actually know that much about Miss Benedict, compared to, say, a lot of these other thinkers that we've discussed, Rand and Aristotle and so on. I know that what was it, the 1930s, I believe, this article from which our excerpt is taken, I think it was in the 1930s that it was written. Yeah, 1934. So this excerpt that we read was taken from the article Anthropology and the Abnormal in Defense of Relativism. And that was from the Journal of General Psychology, Volume 10, Number 1, page 59 through 62, 64 through 65, 71 through 74, and 76 through 77. So the gist of all that, right, the whole point was 1934. I believe she was born roughly the turn of the century, and so she's another contemporary, in terms of the history of philosophy, contemporary thinker. And really, I mentioned how I don't know too much about her. Really, what I know about her is because of moral relativism. Pretty much every class I've been in where we discuss moral relativism, it was Ruth Benedict that we read. And so, it's not an accident then that we turned to her as well to read up on moral relativism. But that's really I think that's what she's most known for. And again, I think it is important to point out that she wrote the article in 1934 because some of what she says, some of her examples, for instance, the homosexuality one, things have changed a little bit since 1934. But I think she would still say, in the context of that example, that, how homosexuals are received, even in present day America, 2020, it can be contrasted significantly with, how they were received in these ancient tribes and so on that she discusses in the text. But I do think it's important to kind of note here at the outset when she's writing this, okay, and put it in sort of a historical context, if you will, because again, these examples she's offering are perspective, and of course we only have one culture here, perspective from various cultures across the world, they've changed since the 1930s. Anyway, so that's Ruth Benedict. She's an anthropologist, so I guess I should have mentioned that, right? So, spent her work days studying, the history of various human cultures, and obviously knows what she's talking about. She, the previous textbook I worked with had a larger excerpt, and so she goes into detail and on other examples, and it's fascinating to hear her give an account of these. And I'll mention some of the ones that weren't actually brought up in our excerpt that are elaborated on in the article elsewhere. But clearly, is very familiar with different kinds of cultures and so on, and very informed on the matter, and gives really great, I think, examples to try to, whether you ultimately agree with her or not, that morality is relative. I think her examples are fascinating and interesting. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead then and dive into this idea of moral relativism. Ruth Benedict, again, is famous for advancing this idea that morality is relative, this idea of moral relativism. Well, what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to suggest morality is relative? Well, it means, in some sense, that what's true for me might not be what's true for you. Okay? So it suggests that moral standards are relative to societies and cultures. And so I think to give it to kind of carve it out in more general terms again, it would behoove us to try to place it in kind of on a kind of spectrum, if you will. And the editors, they actually talk about these four different perspectives I think it's pages 3 through 5. They outline these, and I wanted to go through these really quick because I think it will help us again kind of get a general grasp for what this idea of moral relativism is. And I tried to think of, what are we characterizing here? There's not a real good way to put it. The author or the editors of our textbook, they put it in terms of, how skeptical one is with respect to morality. Can morality be known, and in what sense? And I think, so I try to capture that over here. And so in general, we're talking about, the sense in which morality can be known, or how is it that morality is knowable. Okay, so that's what all 4 of these are saying something about. Okay, so on the one hand, we'll have what I call, or generally refer to as moral skepticism, what the editors refer to as moral nihilism, in that what was it, pages 3 through 5. And what we mean here is the general idea is there's no such thing as morality, so says the moral nihilist or the moral skeptic, someone like Friedrich Nietzsche. There is no such thing as morality. Moral judgments are unintelligible in some sense, or not defensible at the very least. So there's no such thing as morality. Moral claims are in some sense meaningless. This is as skeptical as it gets, obviously, moral skepticism. That makes sense. So that's this end of the spectrum. And I guess maybe we should first contrast that then with the other extreme, if you will, and that's the idea of moral objectivism. Look, there are moral truths, and not only that, they exist regardless of what individuals think about morality. There are these moral truths, and their truth does not hinge on the perspectives of individuals and or cultures or groups of individuals or societies. There are moral truths, and again, their truth does not depend on what groups of people or individuals think of morality. They might be right and they might be wrong with respect to what they think of morality, and there is this underlying truth, right, that they may be right or wrong about. Okay? And so then in between, we have sort of steps or degrees, you might say. So moral relativism then is the idea that there is such a thing as morality. There are moral truths, but they depend on one's environment or one's culture, one's surroundings. Right? So they hinge on what groups of people, right, think or have to say regarding morality. Okay, so yes, there are moral truths, but they're dependent on groups of people and their perspective of morality. Okay, and then we have a lot of these thinkers might say one more step towards moral skepticism. By the way, James Rachels, we'll talk about this in the part 2 video. He says one of the reasons why he's so concerned with moral relativism is he thinks it's one final step in some sense to moral skepticism, and this is what he's really worried about. So he actually talks about how then, right, moral relativism, which seems so easy to jump on board with, right? So a lot of people subscribe to this idea. It seems very enticing, at least without reflecting further, Rachel would say. And he says, well, if you go there, well, then it's not much further, he would say, to go here, and then, what's really of concern to get here, and to ultimately say there's no such thing as morality. So again, each of these, the editors would suggest, and Rachel's would suggest, is sort of then a closer and closer step to moral skepticism. So there's this idea, okay, yes, there's moral truths, but they're dependent on, again, one's culture or what a group of people think about it, right? And then you could take another step and say, okay, yes, there's moral truths, but it comes down to the individual, never mind groups of people. Right? So, and this is more known as moral subjectivism. Okay, there are moral truths, but it boils down to what each individual thinks. Right? And then so, you can see the worry there for many people. Well, in that case, in what sense is there really any truth at all? I mean, that just sounds like nothing more than just, an opinion or a preference, right? In what sense, if that's the case, in what sense is there really any kind of objective truth at all, right? Haven't you lost going to this notion that the truth of morality lies in the subject? Haven't you lost any notion of objective truth whatsoever? And so then you're going to just say that can be then reduced to moral skepticism. But anyway, if you've heard of these 4 different terms, moral objectivism, moral relativism, moral subjectivism, and moral skepticism or moral nihilism, hopefully now you have kind of a better understanding of what exactly that means. And there's no such thing as any kind of moral truth, and morality doesn't exist. Versus, yes, there are moral truths, and morality does exist, and doesn't hinge on what we as individuals or groups of people think about it whatsoever. Okay? The truth exists and it is as it is, regardless of opinion or perspective of it. Okay? This, again, retains the idea that there's truth regarding morality. There are moral truths, morality exists, okay? But it boils down to, it's relative to, it depends on what groups of people, societies, cultures think about it. Okay? Yes, there's still morality still exists. There are moral truths, but it depends on, right? It boils down to what individuals, each individual thinks about morality. Right? So again, hopefully that's making a little bit more sense. You've probably heard of one or more of those terms. Let's go ahead then. Actually, I forgot to do. So going back to slide 2 then, I kind of fleshed out what moral relativism is in general. Pointing the editor of my previous textbook, he describes or suggests that moral relativism is, quote, the theory that the validity of moral principles is dependent on cultural or subjective acceptance, end quote. And again, who's Ruth Benedict? Well, she's the one. If you, just like in utilitarianism, I mentioned that if you only encountered one thinker in a class with respect, and you're talking about utilitarianism, and you only were to read one thing, it's going to be by Mill. Well, the same thing holds true of Benedict, right? If you were going to read one thing in a class regarding moral relativism, odds are it's going to be Ruth Benedict. So she's offering one of the cases, better known cases for moral relativism. And again, Poyman, the editor of my previous textbook, describing what Benedict's up to. He says, quote, Benedict sets forth a theory of moral relativism in which moral principles are based on the common beliefs and practices of social systems. Since these systems or cultures can vary, so can morality. End quote. Okay, let's turn then to slide 3 and talk a little bit about this idea of value bias. And then relatedly, this notion that the evolution and the change of values and what people prefer and seem to value, over time, that is not some sort of indication of an objectively proper set of values that everyone's sort of over time being steered towards, right? And that it's going to be inevitable that they all sort of become funneled towards this objectively appropriate set of values. But no, she'll say, rather, when one set of values becomes popular, it's only a kind of a historical accident. It could have been the case that a completely and maybe even contradicting set of values became popular, but it just happened to be the case that this one did. So we're going to flesh that kind of idea out now. So this is, again, slide 3 here. We're going to erase this. We're going to want some space here. So again, we're talking about value bias and the sort of the what's going on when values evolve over time. So we're going to offer a picture here. We begin, so let's say this is time. And then we begin, the idea is at the beginning of time, right, we begin with all these different groups of people or cultures. And then the idea is over time, for whatever reasons, right, they run into each other and they encounter one another. With a few exceptions, she says. And she says, hey, look, it's very fortunate we have these exceptions because it clues us in on sort of our fallacious thinking and our tendency to, again, prop up our own way of looking at life and our own values and demean others when that shouldn't really be taking place. We think that our values and our way of living and way of looking at life is special just because it's popular. And she wants to say, well, there's nothing necessarily special about it. So anyway, over time then, most of these are going to eventually, think of things like the internet especially, which, again, wasn't around when she wrote this article, but it's going to be even more the case that all these originally disparate cultures become more and more entwined or intermingled, right? And so basically what happens then is more or less all these different cultures over time, they become fewer and fewer different ones, right? And she wants to say again, so look what happens. Let's throw another one down here to suggest what we're talking about here. So over time, eventually, you get fewer and fewer, again, different, distinct cultures. And so what this ends up doing is, right, certain values become so popular, right? 99% of people believe certain things or value certain things, again, over multiple continents, say this is now, right? That we think, hey, there must be a reason why seemingly everyone shares these particular values. There must be something special about those, right? There must be a reason why 99% of people look at life this way and value these certain things. And what Benedict wants to show again to us is that no, that was just an accident. Look, let's say we could go all the way back here, and let's say these two cultures never met, right? Just these did. And let's say this one, which was on its own in our original scenario, actually ends up meeting up with these, right? And the idea is all these intermingle. And this one, in some sense, is the minority, right? That way of looking at things. It could have been completely the opposite, or a completely different approach to life and set of values could have been the predominant ones. Okay, so, and I find that that's an interesting point. I find that compelling. It's interesting, this idea that just because something becomes more and more popular, right, or a way of looking at things becomes more and more popular, doesn't mean that that's any indication that it's the proper way to look at things, or that we ought to be valuing whatever it is. So she warns us that, quote, the standardization of custom and belief over a couple of continents has given a false sense of the inevitability of the particular forms that have gained currency. And we need to turn to a wider survey in order to check the conclusions we hastily base upon this near universality of familiar customs. Again, I tried to explain that, right? That we think that, again, there's something special just because it's nearly universal, right? Well, just because something's popular doesn't mean there is anything special about it. It could still be completely incorrect, right? There could be a proper way of looking at morality, and all these people just are completely wrong, right? Even though it's 99% of them, right? The values they uphold and show a preference for, they could be terrible ones. Right? So there's nothing special just because something's popular. So if we do this, she says, we'll notice that, quote, modern civilization, whatever happens to be popular in the case, right, where most of us are, it's not up here anymore, but most of us are down here. Quote, modern civilization becomes not a necessary pinnacle of human achievement, but one entry in a long series of possible adjustments. It could have been completely different. So, end quote. That's from 14 of our text. So what are the effects of this value bias? So she's shown that what we tend to do, right, this is a bias, and it's it's something we do it psychologically, but it's not indicative of truth per se, right? And it shines through then in kind of how we. So turning to slide 4, talking about the effects of this value bias, it not only affects kind of how we view our way of living and our values versus ones that are minority, but then it makes it affects all walks of life in some sense. It can make and she talks at length about this. It can make life for those who don't share the upheld values, right? The ones that are dominant in particular cultures. It can make life terrible for such individuals. People that will be referred to as deviants. More on those types, those people later, right? But the effect of our psychological tendency to just automatically uphold whatever is popular in our immediate environment, it can have significant pervasive effects. That's the upshot here. And just our idea, and this of course is what we're most concerned with respect to morality. What our idea of morality, what's moral and what's immoral, and our idea of in general what's normal and abnormal. These are obviously then going to be affected in the same way. Okay, what's moral and what's immoral depends on who you ask, right? And again, just because 99% of people, right, tend to think of, or uphold a certain moral stance, doesn't mean, right, that that's the only way, right, or the only perspective we can have on that particular moral issue, or necessarily that it's the proper one or right one to have. There are these alternatives nonetheless, and who's to say that they aren't, possibly correct themselves, in which case the 99% were just wrong. So this also, again, affects this bias we have, affects all aspects of our values, whether it be moral or our notion of what's normal and abnormal and so on. Okay? So we deem prominent the values in our own society normal, the values that are prominent in our own society normal, and those that are not so prominent or popular abnormal. Okay, and then her point though is, hey, look, other cultures are doing the exact same thing. So what we consider normal versus abnormal. Let's say thing A we consider normal. She's saying, well, the same thing is happening in other cultures, right? They're looking at these same things and at times deeming the same thing the opposite. So some cultures eat meat, some cultures, and that's normal, and some cultures don't, and that's abnormal. Okay, so she's pointing out the same thing is at the same time both normal and abnormal. And of course, this applies to morality. The same thing can then be both moral and immoral depending on what culture you consult or what group of people you ask. Okay. So the same values are considered both normal and abnormal by different societies, and so too, as I mentioned, right? The idea of what's moral and immoral depends on, it's relative to the culture or society we ask. And that's what she says. So it's turning to slide 5. That's the upshot with respect to morality then. That's the conclusion she wants us to reach regarding morality, regarding, what's normal and abnormal, regarding values in general, right? It's that they're relative. So she emphasizes, again, this is slide 5, emphasizes the extent to which norms vary across societies and cultures. And this is a very interesting point I think she raises. And I always mention this in my face-to-face classes. For whatever reason, let's say you are really struggling with things, or maybe you've been depressed throughout life. I find this reflection on her part inspiring and hopeful for any of you to whom that might apply, right? Maybe things are difficult. And it's basically this idea that, look, if you're struggling, if you've had a rough time, it might not be a reflection of you. The issue might not be you, right? It might be the group you're with or the environment you're in. So if you find yourself struggling over time, the idea is, hey, maybe you just need to move, go somewhere else, find a new environment. And lo and behold, far from struggling, she'll point out, right, because you might not subscribe to what's normal in that culture, far from struggling, right, in this different culture, you might even flourish and be extremely happy. Okay? So I find it very uplifting. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. When she says on page 15, quote of our textbook, quote, one of the most striking facts that emerge from a study of widely varying cultures is the ease with which our abnormals function in other cultures, end quote. So there might be something to this, right? If, what should we be prescribing to people who are extremely stressed out? A move, right? Move to somewhere else. Maybe join a new club. Maybe that's pretty drastic, moving to a new geographical location. But surrounding yourself with new people, maybe, right? A new kind of environment in some sense, right? And then the sense in which you are constantly feeling like you're at odds then with what's normal, maybe that'll change then accordingly, and you won't fight that constant uphill battle that she says the deviant is constantly facing. Okay. So at any rate, right, the upshot of all this is that there's no universally normal, abnormal values. There's no universal, morality. There's no sense in which something is morally true in a universal sense. Right? It always hinges on or depends on the culture or environment or group of people with that we're discussing, or that the morality or the issue applies to. And she gives some interesting examples then, turning to slide 6, when we talked about, or I've alluded to these, interesting ones. So she talks about on page 15 of our text, sort of those who have mystical experiences, think like shamans. Okay, if we see someone that seems in the middle of a trance, right, in our present day America, most of us aren't going to think very highly of that person, right? Our culture, most nowadays in this culture. And her point is that hasn't been the case. By and large, historically speaking, it's been the opposite, in fact, that those who experience these kind of like trance-like experiences, they're actually elevated and highly esteemed in cultures. Okay? So that's one example she mentions is, this idea of mystics or having, these mystical experiences where you're kind of in like in a trance. So she points out again on page 15, while, quote, even a very mild mystic is aberrant in our culture, most peoples have regarded even extreme psychic manifestations not only as normal and desirable, but even as characteristic of highly valued and gifted individuals, end quote. And again, she's talking from a historical perspective, across all cultures. It's been the tendency actually to elevate, individuals, like shamans or individuals who have these trance-like experiences. And so not only are they not viewed with this condemnation that they might be greeted with in our present culture, but they actually flourish, right? It's the exact opposite. They have a far different sort of experience. Right, then the second example she gives, and I alluded to this one earlier, is homosexuality. So she contrasts, how homosexuals are received in America. Of course, again, she's writing this in the 1930s, okay, in 1934 specifically, and she juxtaposes, the reception of homosexuals in the American culture with, think, Plato's time, ancient Greece, where homosexuality was very, very common, and it wasn't something thought of as being deviant, and thus those who were homosexual did not, they weren't confronted with the issues that they might be in present day America. And ancient Greece isn't the only example, where homosexuals were treated much differently. Right? She mentions various American Indian tribes and so on. So again, she points out in these other societies, homosexuals, as opposed to America, quote, we're not left exposed to the conflicts that visit the deviant who is excluded from participation in the recognized patterns of his society, end quote. And that was on 17. And then the best example, they, in the text of our textbook, when they have the three dots, dot, 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 that means they're skipping some in the article. And towards the end, you get her referencing the Northwest Coast tribes, but we don't actually get the her going through the example because it skipped it in our excerpt. But the previous text I worked with did have it, and it was a fascinating example. There's actually a couple of them that she referenced that were not directly discussed in our excerpt. One was this tribe where, and this might have been the Northwest Coast tribes, where if someone is killed, then the proper thing to do is go and kill someone else. And it doesn't matter who originally or how the person that you are connected to died. It doesn't matter how they were killed, whether it was an accident, heart attack, or whatever. The proper thing to do was go out and kill someone else in response. And if you didn't do that, that was abnormal, and then you were criticized. Again, it didn't matter who you went out and killed or what originally killed the person you were familiar with. None of that matters. The proper thing to do is then go, what was the word, sort of make up for it somehow by, the idea was killing someone else. And again, that was the normal. And if you didn't do that, well, then you faced significant problems. And then the other fascinating example, which I refer to as paranoia on slide 6, okay, is think of someone with like a cheery, sunny disposition, smiling all the time, wants to help others. Okay. There's this culture she discusses where they were so paranoid. This is just how they existed in an everyday sense. They were constantly paranoid. And that's just how everyone in the culture was. You didn't accept food from others because it might be poisoned, so on and so forth. There's constant mistrust, okay? And that was just the norm. And so if you had somebody that then walked in this society with a sunny, cheery disposition, smiling and wanting to help, they're going to be looked at as crazy, right, and lock them up. Whereas she points out, somebody that's foaming from the mouth and coming at you with a knife, they're not as likely to be locked up in such a culture, because they probably think that you're out to get them, and that's the norm, right? So in this culture where paranoia is the cornerstone of the culture, right, where it pervades every element of the culture and the way they live, this person who is so cheery and wants to help others, they're going to face significant uphill battles, right, and huge struggles. And they're the ones that are going to then be condemned in such a culture. So it's fascinating to think that there are cultures where, again, somebody so with such a cheery disposition will actually experience, right, huge issues that confront the deviant in general. So she mentions, with respect to this example, in such cultures where this paranoia is so dominant, the quote, man of sunny, kindly disposition who liked work and liked to be helpful was looked upon as the deviant. So that person was a deviant, not the person that was paranoid and attacking people with knives and so on. No, that's normal because no one can be trusted, right? Or so everyone in that culture thought. And so here are some examples, again, she points to suggest different cultures, different groups of people have these varying beliefs regarding, how we ought to look at someone who is smiling at us and offering to help us, how we ought to look at homosexuals, or how we ought to look at people in trances, who are shamans or so on. Right? We have all these different ways of viewing, or how do we treat, or how should we best deal with those who have died? Do we cremate them? Do we bury them? Some cultures believe in eating the dead, right? So what's the proper perspective? And our whole point is, again, the point of the moral relativist is there are these all these different ways of looking at it. It doesn't seem like there is then, right, a proper and an objective, absolute sense perspective, right? There is no underlying truth to the matter. It depends on then what culture you consult. Okay, so that's turning to slide 7 then, right? That's the reason why she then wants to make the case for moral relativism. Look how different cultures and societies view these kinds of things. Isn't that indicative then that there must not be any fundamental truth or proper way that we ought to deal with the dead, or ought to deal with those who were, prone to trance-like episodes? So she wants to suggest, right, that these kinds of examples, of which there are many, 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 she says, as an anthropologist, right? But these examples, quote, and this is again slide 7, quote, force upon us the fact that normality is culturally defined, end quote. And that's from page 17 of our textbook. So she also reflects again on the evolution of values, and she mentions how most of it's just, it's just accidental how it happens to take place, right? And if we didn't have a certain war at a certain time, or certain people didn't go on boats and go different places at certain times, and so on and so forth, well, then you might have completely different, turn of events then. Right? And then she also talks though about how every culture, right, has these certain initial proclivities or tendencies, right, or values that they have. And then the idea is the more that culture is left to its own devices without external influence, the more and more pronounced that original approach, that original set of values that was upheld, and so on, the more and more that's going to become pronounced in that culture and dominant. Right? And the only way that's not going to be the case, again, is if some other external force or culture meets them or it influences that original culture. Otherwise, again, the idea is whatever set of values were began as sort of the tendency, they're going to become more and more and more pronounced and more dominant over time. So that's what she's getting at on page 18 of our text when she says, quote, every society beginning with some slight inclination in one direction or another carries its preference farther and farther, integrating itself more and more completely upon its chosen basis and discarding those types of behavior that are uncongenial. And bottom of slide 7, she makes a distinct, and I would say, I guess not controversial, but a debatable claim. So again, I've discussed this at the bottom of slide 7. She makes the claim that moral relativism is becoming more popular over time, that more and more of us, okay, so it's one thing to say morality is relative, and to be a moral relativist. It's another thing to say, it's a different claim than to say moral relativism is becoming more popular. And so she makes that claim as well. So she seems to be a moral relativist. Morality is relative, right? And then she also makes the claim that moral relativism is becoming more popular. More and more people are subscribing to it. More and more people are, as she suggests, realizing that morality hinges on, what groups of people think. Okay, and is she right about that? I'll ask you about that, I think, in the intermission, one of the intermission questions. Okay? So there's one issue, one thing to wrestle with the idea of moral relativism itself. Is it correct? And it's another thing to then wrestle with the issue, is moral relativism popular as a moral theory? And she seems to, again, advance moral relativism, suggests that that's the proper moral theory, right? And she seems to advance, as I'll mention here in a moment, right, that it's becoming more popular as a theory. She says, after all, on page 18 of the textbook, quote, "We recognize that morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits," end quote. And she makes the point, that this realization is becoming more and more common, as we advance historically. Okay, last thing I want to discuss real quick, and hopefully you can read this idea of deviance. Okay, and we probably have a general idea of what a deviant is, just on the face of things, right? One who deviates, right? One who's different. Right? And it's not surprising that the upshot of what she's going to have to say about the deviant is that the deviant has a very difficult life. And another thing she's going to say, right, is that, not surprisingly then, and when I first kind of read through this and was sort of soaking in what she had to say, this almost seemed insulting. But I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense. She says, given how hard of a life the deviant has, most people are just going to subscribe readily to whatever's popular in their cultures. It's going to go, and so it seemed kind of insulting. Are you saying like we're just kind of mindless and we just go with the flow of whatever's popular? And I mean, that kind of seems like the upshot of what's being said here. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? Again, given the difficulties facing the deviant, the person who doesn't subscribe to what's normal in their culture, that's going to yield a pretty rough life, possibly, right? If you're homosexual, for example, in a culture that ostracizes homosexuality, well, then that's going to suck, right? So it's not surprising, given that the large majority of human beings, no matter what culture they're in, are just going to subscribe to that culture's values, the dominant ones in that culture. So the deviants, though, going back to this idea of deviants refer to those people within a particular culture or society whose values conflict, right, with those that tend to be prominent within that culture. On 19, Benedict says, quote, "Those individuals whose characteristics are not congenial to the selected type of human behavior in that community are the deviants," end quote. And she says, given a large enough population, there are going to be, again, some deviants. You're going to get an expression, as she puts it, of, pretty much in a large enough population, you'll get some people expressing all the possible behaviors that she says, right? All the tendencies, okay, with a sufficiently large enough population, and you'll have then some deviants, okay. Well, that's the case, right? Most, again, are going to just more than willingly subscribe to whatever's popular in their particular culture. And so that's why she says on 19, quote, "Most individuals are plastic to the molding forces of the society into which they are born," end quote. Okay, we can just be molded easily and take the shape of whatever our culture, right, whatever is popular and common in our culture or our society. Quote, "Happily, the majority of mankind readily take any shape that is presented to them," end quote. That's from page 20 of the text. And so I allude to on the bottom of slide 8, again, the difficulties that the deviant is confronted with if they don't subscribe to what's normal in their society. It's gonna not be a fun existence for the most part. And so is it surprising then, as Benedict suggests, that so many people are just readily willing to go with the flow of the norm, so to speak. So those who are abnormal in a culture right, or those that are the deviant or the minority, quote, can register in their own culture only by doing violence to their congenial responses or their natural, right, responses, and acquiring others that are difficult for them, end quote. So if they're going to try to get by for the deviant, they're going to have to just kind of squelch as best they can what they really want to do, what's natural for them, what they really want to value, and what they naturally want to value. To get along better in that society, they're going to have to try to cut off what they, their natural preferences as much as they can. Or better, maybe, right? They could just move, and then they wouldn't have to do any of that. Okay? But again, thus that is the sort of outlook for the deviant. It's not promising unless you like a life full of turmoil and difficulty. Okay, so that's the idea of deviance. I think that is where we'll wrap up the part 1 video then. So if you want, right, you can address one of these intermission questions. What do you make of moral relativism? Are you on board with Rachel's? Do you think she makes a good case for moral relativism? And maybe setting aside whether you think of yourself as a moral relativist or not, do you think she makes a good case for moral relativism? Maybe you ultimately disagree, you're not a moral relativist, but you can still concede that she makes a good case for her position. Or maybe you don't think so. Maybe you are a moral relativist and you think she presents a crappy case for moral relativism. So anyway, that's the gist of question 1. And then question 2 gets at that separate claim, never mind whether moral relativism is, actually the proper moral view to take. Is it the case that it's becoming a more popular moral view, that more people are subscribing to it? And so that's what question 2 is asking you to address. Do you agree with her sentiments that it is becoming a more popular view? Okay, so that's it for the first part. For the second part, again, we'll turn our attention to James Rachel's, who's going to present the case against moral relativism, suggest why we ought to be, at the very least, very leery about accepting moral relativism. And so we'll talk about, again, the typical argument he suggests is advanced by the moral relativist, what he calls the cultural differences argument, and we'll talk about why he thinks that's invalid and unsound. Okay, so he says their typical kind of argument is no good. But then he concedes, right, that doesn't necessarily prove that moral relativism is in fact incorrect, right? It just shows that their typical support for it is flawed. And then he says, well, let's see what happens if we accept moral relativism. And so he's going to discuss some troubling and disturbing negative consequences associated with accepting moral relativism, right? If we really do accept moral relativism, then, for example, he's going to say we better be prepared not to condemn other cultures who, for example, practice slavery or rape or whatever the case might be, right? We have no license, he's going to say, if we truly adopt and endorse moral relativism, we have no license then to judge other cultures who might be practicing these things that are deemed abnormal or wrong in our own culture. Okay? At least if you're being a consistent moral relativist, that's how you ought to approach things. And he wants to say, isn't that troubling then? Don't we want to feel like we have the license to condemn certain things, no matter what particular cultures say? And then again, he's going to suggest, let's take a look, going back to that cultural differences argument, then the premise of that argument is it in fact the case that different cultures really do have fundamentally different values? And he's going to try to suggest no, or at least that the examples offered by the moral relativists are typically overblown, and that upon further reflection, the same fundamental values are actually at play with respect to these different cultures, that they don't have conflicting values after all. And then he's going to, speaking again to that premise, he's going to suggest that there have to be, at the very least, certain values that are adopted universally across all societies for them to exist in the first place. Okay? So at the very least, not everything about morality can be relative. Okay? They have to look at certain elements of morality in the same way universally. Things like prohibiting murder. I mentioned that one earlier. For the society to even exist, he's going to say, you have to prohibit murder, otherwise it's going to fall apart. Okay? So we'll, again, elaborate on all these kinds of points that Rachel's is going to offer, and he's going to ultimately suggest that we ought to be very leery of moral relativism. Although one of the things I like about him is he also concedes that there are some benefits to the notion that morality is relative, and to consulting different cultures who might have different ways of looking at things. that we can glean some benefits from, this moral relativist approach. But by and large, or overall, we cannot view morality as being relative. There have to be certain things about it, at the very least, that are not relative. And he's going to, again, suggest that we have to be very leery of it because it's one step away from moral skepticism or moral nihilism, where Friedrich Nietzsche resides. And again, I guess the upshot is he wants us to avoid that at all costs. So that's what you have to look forward to in the part 2 video. Again, James Rachel's and his case against moral relativism. All right, thank you.